Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Green Flame, the deep green resistance broadcast that brings you radical analysis, practical skills, and artistic expression from the revolutionary movement to defend the planet and rebuild just human communities. I am your host and comrade, Max Wilbert. Before we start today's episode of The Green Flame, I want to remind everyone about the event that we hosted a few weeks ago in November called Drawing the Line, Stopping the Murder of the Planet. It was a live streaming event that went on for about 4 hours and included conversations with grassroots activists from around the world. It was fascinating, and for those who were there, I think everyone really enjoyed it. If you weren't able to watch the event live, the recording is available now. It's on our Deep Green Resistance YouTube channel as well as our Facebook page. So if you didn't get a chance to watch live, I recommend that you go check it out right now. The event is also a fundraiser, and we're hoping to raise a little bit more money to support our work. We're completely reliant on grassroots donors. We can't get any foundation funding. We're simply too radical. And so we're really grateful for everyone who donated during this live event and who has supported us over the years. And if you want to support us today, go check out the video. You can find a link to donate in the descriptions of those videos, or you can simply go to our website, deepgreenresistance.org, and click the donate link. Thank you all so much, and now let's get to the show. On today's episode of The Green Flame, I'm pleased to bring you an interview with Helena Norberg-Hoge. She is the founder and director of Local Futures, and it's a fascinating conversation. We talk about globalization, economics, the process of forcing people off subsistence living and into cities, which in my opinion is a fundamental part of the process of civilization, the expansion of civilization, the expansion of the culture of empire and capitalism around the world. And it's really a fascinating discussion that brought up some issues that I had never quite thought of in this way before. I was reminded when Helena and I were speaking during this segment about climate activists of a quote from the forthcoming book, Bright Green Lies, that I co-wrote with Derek Jensen and Lear Keith. And at the beginning of chapter 7 of that book, which is on efficiency, we include this quote from Frederick Winslow Taylor, who wrote, "In the past, man has been first. In the future, the system must be first." And this is a fascinating quote to me because, as we detail in this chapter, Taylor was the inventor of Taylorism, of this scientific method of efficiency. He basically was the progenitor of the entire modern factory process, the assembly line process that was, adopted by Henry Ford and popularized by him and spread throughout the entire economy around the world. And what's interesting about this, particularly to me, is that Frederick Winslow Taylor was a Quaker. And Quakers hold these values of peace, of cooperation, of equality. And Taylor actually thought that by increasing the efficiency of industrial production, he would be able to help the economy create such a vast surplus of energy, of money, of wealth, of consumer goods, that everyone would have plenty, that it could be shared so broadly that class differences would essentially be abolished, and that everyone could live off the plenty of this industrial production. Of course, that ignores that industrial production is based on destruction of and stealing from the land. But what is fascinating about this to me is that Taylor was an avowed Quaker. He believed this. He believed that increasing the efficiency of these industrial processes would help poor workers. The reality, of course, was the exact opposite. That extra wealth that was created by the increased efficiencies in factories around the world went straight to the ruling class. And workers who had once been skilled laborers working in crafts and dedicated to their work over, lifetimes with apprenticeships and various systems that were human in their scale and in their relational basis, that was replaced by the breakdown of labor to its lowest common denominator, to the point where, whether you're making a computer or a tire or a car or a water bottle or a light bulb, each process in that production cycle was broken down so that somebody would just be screwing in screws, and somebody would be sanding or polishing the metal, and somebody would be doing the next thing. So everyone's labor became incredibly simplified, and that made people replaceable. So Frederick Winslow Taylor's work actually had the exact opposite effect, as I said, of what he intended. It made the workforce completely expendable. It made them replaceable, and it made them, essentially identical. It led to this era of non-skilled labor in which, wages are driven down, quality of life is driven down, and all the power and all the wealth is concentrated in the hands of the ruling class, of those who own the means of production. So, this relates, I think, so directly to what Helena and I talk about in this segment around, the climate movement today, and how it has been completely drawn into this mindset based in industrial production, not just in the way that we talk about in this interview, but also around the green economy in general, around the ideas that green energy will save the planet, around the ideas that we need to, create a Green New Deal and drive sort of this global scale green economy based on trillions of dollars of wealth going often to private corporations, to build buildings, to insulate things, to install new energy systems and electric grids and so on. All of this is built within a certain mindset. A premise has been slipped by us here. And just like Frederick Winslow Taylor, who thought that his innovations would lead to a better quality of life for poor working people, these climate activists think that their advocacy, that their work will lead to a green planet, will lead to, the reversal of global warming and the protection of the natural world. It's actually wrong. It's not true. They have the wrong information. And so they are, in many cases, the impulses, the motivations are good. But what we're actually seeing as these things start to play out on the real world, just like we did with Frederick Winslow Taylor, is the exact opposite of what those people actually wished would occur. I'm here today with Helena Norberg-Hoge. She is the founder and director of both Local Futures and the International Alliance for Localization. Helena is a pioneer of the local economy movement. She has received the Right Livelihood Award, the Arthur Morgan Award, among others. She's the author of several books, including Ancient Futures and most recently, Local is Our Future, Steps to an Economics of Happiness. So Helena, I'm really glad to have you here, and I hope your day is going well today. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. I had a bad day because Zoom was giving me so much trouble, but other than that, I'm good.
Yeah, technology biting the hand that feeds it. As I was just saying to you before we started the recording, we can assume that most people listening to this show already understand the problems with globalization, understand that corporations, exploit global free trade agreements and international banks to funnel wealth and resources away from the poor and to the rich. So we can assume that, and the other side of things is, I think we can also assume that the audience sort of knows that living locally is not necessarily this scary, terrible thing where you're going to be very deprived and it's going to be awful, but that it's a much better way for us to live as human beings. So generally speaking, I think people can understand that. But would you mind just sort of giving a little introduction to your work, how you got started on this path, and how you got to the point you're at now, and then we can sort of dive into talking about strategy and the work that you're doing around localization.
Okay, yeah. Well, I grew up in Sweden, and I had studied in several different countries, including Germany and France, and learned lots of languages. And I was living in Paris working as a linguist when I was invited to go out as part of the film team to this unknown part of Tibet called Ladakh. It's the westernmost part of Tibet, and it belonged politically to India. It had been sealed off for the entire modern era. And in the colonial era, it was just too remote. They basically didn't have their economy trashed by colonial forces. So I came into contact with this remarkable place where they still had their own economy, their own production from their own resources, their own knowledge system, along with deep self respect. And I learned to speak the language fluently. I was only going to be there for a while to help make a film. But I fell in love with these radiantly happy people and with this beautiful part of the world. And I ended up working with the local people to try to bring information about the fact that the development that was just starting to happen as the region was open to the outside world was bringing all kinds of things that they had no experience of and didn't know were quite harmful. Like they were suddenly bombarded with ag experts telling them that DDT and other pesticides were great for their crops, and a hospital was being built mainly of asbestos, and the entire development process led by the Indian government was based on fossil fuels and bringing in, among other things, coal and kerosene for heating in winter. And so I ended up as this basically in an unusual role, basically providing information about the realities of what was happening in the Western world, and that actually wasn't a paradise where we were all just sitting around not having to do much work, but we had discovered that many of the sort of improvements and the progress that we'd experienced was bringing health issues and all kinds of side effects. And so we had an organic movement already. We had banned DDT, we'd actually banned asbestos, and many people were aware. This was in the mid 70s. Already then, many people were aware that they wanted renewable energy instead of fossil fuels. So I ended up working with the local people and essentially helping to start an ecological development group, not for me to come in as an outsider to tell the Ladakhis how to live or to grow their food or their economy, but to provide alternatives to the things that were coming in. So, for instance, we started a project with renewable energy, and that was quite successful, mainly passive solar for heating and some greenhouses and so on. But the whole process, which ended up actually taking many decades, already after 4 or 5 years, I was so aware that there was a need to raise awareness in the West about what was happening on the other side of the world in the name of development. And that lots of things that seemed to be good, like microcredit and all kinds of things, even schooling, weren't actually what we thought they were. They were actually herding people into urban centers. And I started already in the 70s doing a lot of speaking, teaching. I was invited to Harvard and Oxford. I taught at Berkeley for a while. And I was also invited into the World Bank and places all around Europe and in America. And I really became familiar with and had as friends most of the environmental movement in the West. But all the time, what was happening was that while I was working every year for part of the year in Ladakh, and later on also in Bhutan, and later on connected to other remote regions like Mongolia and meeting with the Maasai, I became aware that this process that was starting in the 80s of globalization was bringing disastrous changes to the so-called undeveloped world. And I ended up, as I say, doing a lot of public speaking and teaching about this. And that's really what my organization does, is to raise awareness about the fact that the enormous increase in CO2 emissions, for instance, and the fact that no country has lowered its emissions has primarily to do with globalization, with this process of allowing and opening the doors for big global businesses to move into countries, so-called poor countries, where labor was cheap. What was happening was that they were able there to set up giant factories with a lot of sweat labor, not very pleasant work at all for people in India, Indonesia, China. And back in the West, they were lobbying the environmental movement to lobby their governments that poor countries shouldn't need to reduce their CO2 emissions. They were instrumental in getting the environmental movement in the West to think that, well, poor countries, of course, they have not created climate change, so they shouldn't be asked to reduce emissions. People weren't aware that the factories that were taking jobs away from America and Europe were actually massively increasing pollution and emissions. And they were increasing it not only because they had big, dirty factories in these poor countries where they had cheap labor, but they were increasing them because everything we were using around the world was being transported more and more. And I'm aware I'm giving you a very long answer, and I'm a bit worried, Max, that I was too wordy in terms of the introduction around
Oh,
Ladakh. What do you think?
no, it's very interesting. And, what you're talking about right now about this whole, it's a really interesting thing because the ideas that you're talking about around climate change, the idea that the poor nations of the world should be allowed and encouraged to increase their pollution levels in order to create a higher standard of living, that idea sort of goes unquestioned in the mainstream environmental movement. But what you're saying is, that whole idea is kind of a fantasy. It's this fantasy based on, a lie, which is that these factories and these sweatshop labor production facilities and these chemical plants and all of these heavy industries that have been outsourced from the wealthy nations to poor nations, that they actually help the local people rather than being a source of exploitation and disease and a source of
And
misery, right?
yeah, yeah. And also, I should add that I saw very, very clearly in Ladakh and Bhutan that this process, which was fundamentally urbanizing in the sense that it pulled people away from regional, local economies where they were producing their own food, clothing, and shelter from their own resources. And it pulled them into city environments where suddenly they were competing for scarce jobs doled out by big business working with central governments. And in that situation, suddenly they became enemies because now there was a scarcity of jobs that had never, ever existed historically in more land based, localized regional economies. Traditionally, unemployment just didn't exist. There's so much work that needs doing. And yeah, so it's a tragedy because now, as people were fighting for scarce jobs and scarce artificially created money, they started fighting each other, and so it's this whole systemic shift of allowing giant global banks and corporations to move around the world is leading to increased violence, fundamentalism, and friction. And in the less developed parts of the world, it still takes often the form of religious and ethnic rivalries, because where there is a sort of group identity, people still identify with that. And so for instance, in Ladakh, the Buddhists ended up fighting the Muslims, They had lived side by side for 500 years previously, and there had never been group conflict. And I witnessed this economic transformation that led to them killing each other. And in the same period in Bhutan, which was majority Buddhist, but there were some Hindus that had a Hindu minority that had also been there for several generations. And this intense economic pressures, centralization, urbanization, creating a scarcity of jobs and cutting people off from the knowledge about the soil, about the plants, about the animals that had provided their basic needs in the past, cutting them off from that and creating this completely desperate dependence on money and a job led inevitably to violent conflict, to bloodshed. Now, I mean, there's so much to say about this. It's a very, very important message, really. I just so pray that people are going to wake up to this, because in the West, at the same time, the pressures on people as unemployment increased. And we have to be really clear that already by the 90s, I had friends, economists in both America and England, who had documented the fact that with increased GDP, the average American and the average Brit were actually getting poorer. I don't know if you remember the book, The Overworked American by Juliet Shaw. That was the American book that basically pointed out that between the 60s and 90s, the average American was having to work harder and harder to the extent that they were working 1 month more per year to stay in place. In England, Richard Douthwaite, who was a close friend and colleague, he wrote the book The Growth Illusion, and he was just looking in terms of rising GDP, how the buying power of the average Brit was going down. Now, it's so important that we become more economically literate to understand how this lies behind the swing to the right, to the fear, the fundamentalism, and the polarization that's going on throughout the world. But in a place like America and in England, it's not taking the form of ethnic breakdown in the same way that it is in the global South. You know, there is still more of an ethnic identity, but it's basically taking the form of a huge rural-urban divide, and essentially small farmers, small business people, and sort of middle America, as compared to the coastal populations, feeling completely marginalized and insecure in their livelihoods, and absolutely vulnerable to the demagogues who come along and say, I'm going to grow the economy for you. Forget about all these trees. We don't need them. We don't. Climate is a fiction anyway. And these refugees are the big problem. We're going to grow the economy for you. Vote for me. Now, this pattern is growing. It's not just in America. It's Bolsonaro. It's even in Scandinavia. We've seen a swing to the right as people have felt more marginalized, more fearful, and there have been more refugees coming in. We really need to look at the systemic root cause of an economic system that in both so-called rich and so-called poor countries is massively threatening the majority of people while creating an ever smaller number of super wealthy people. We all know this obscene wealth extraction that in every single country I know of has escalated, particularly in the last 30, 35 years, to such visible, obscene proportions. We know that, and yet, unless we have a holistic big picture, we are not linking that to the climate issue, to the extinction of species, to also the loss of democracy, also an epidemic of depression, as well as an epidemic of polarization, anger, and violence. But our work around the world starting in Ladakh and Bhutan, opened our eyes to this process, because we were every year on the ground in that so-called poor part of the world, and then we were coming back to the West. And it was so obvious that this economic transformation that was happening at a level that unfortunately most local activists just weren't able to see, to be informed about. It led to people being easily channeled into more narrow focus, into just focusing on climate or just focusing on whatever it might be. And so I guess my plea is that the action we need to take today, the most important action, is to be willing to say, okay, there is something really serious going on here. And maybe we don't know enough. Maybe we need to take a deep breath and just spend a little bit of time looking at the bigger picture so that we can identify the levers, the vehicles, the strategies for genuinely systemic change. And by systemic, let's remember what we're talking about here is there is a path where we can be healing ecosystems and people at the same time. There is genuinely a path towards real ecological and not just ecological benefit and healing, but systemically healing and creating more secure livelihoods and creating more visible, accountable economic structures so that the democratic process has a chance of being revived. But if I could just say about democracy that the big picture would allow us to recognize that our policies are being shaped by the global banks and corporations. Our worldview is being shaped by them. Big money has come to dominate everything from school books to obviously universities, science, and the media. Virtually every avenue of knowledge has been dominated by big money. Now, this means, for instance, in Scandinavia, that we used to have in these more socialist states, we had quite a big budget for science in the public interest. And I would argue that that's why a lot of the research about the impact of pesticides on our health and so on came from Scandinavia. I would also argue that's why we had, for a while, much more strong and serious warnings about the impact of mobile phones on our health, because there was still more science in the public interest. But unfortunately, because through trade treaties, governments have been pressured to go along with these treaties where they essentially say what Obama said after 2008, when we'd had a financial crisis that was exposing the insanity of letting global banks and financial institutions create money out of thin air and then gamble and trade with our lives. They were trading in these packages of mortgages of people whom they'd never met. They had no idea where they were, who they were. And there was this speculation going on, these structures of trade with hedge funds and layer upon layer of a make-believe world that had disastrous impact on our lives. But Obama ends up, after there's such clarity, we need to regulate this industry. We need to have some sense of what's going on. We need to have some rules and regulations here. Obama concludes, no, too big to fail. And we're, it's a very scary thing that since 2008, we're moving in a direction where these giant hedge funds linked to the techno industry and very much linked to the military, to the Pentagon, are moving in a direction that is very, very destructive and frightening. In the meanwhile, why I'm so motivated and what I do feel real hope is that if you look carefully to the grassroots, and if you look at what people want, what communities want, you'll see a real reason for hope.
I was so struck by what you said about the climate change activists, and it reminded me of a few things that I wanted to bring up and maybe hear your thoughts or bounce some ideas around. But I read an article a couple of years ago that was an argument back and forth between two different writers, one of whom was saying global GDP is rising. This is a wonderful thing. And the other, who I agreed with, was saying, no, what we're actually seeing is, the term he used was the proletarianization of the global population. I wouldn't describe myself as a Marxist, but I think there's some useful analysis there and useful terminology. And he was basically saying what we are seeing over the past decades across the world is subsistence peoples being increasingly forced to move into cities and into the global economy. And if you are a mainstream economist, you can slap a number value on that and you can say, in dollars, those people's GDP went up, their income went up. But if you're actually a human being, if you're actually on the ground, you can say that person's quality of life went down, their relationships went down, the quality of their land was destroyed, they were forced off their ancestral lands, right? They were forced to work in this factory producing cheap plastic crap or something like that. And so
Yeah.
he was really arguing that, this process of, again, proletarianization of the global population is not something that anyone should be celebrating or looking at as a good thing. If you just look at a few numbers, you can say, sure, GDP is going up, but what you're really seeing is the impoverishment and the destruction of community.
I really hope that anyone who wants to see that more closely would look at my book, Ancient Futures, and at our film, Ancient Futures, because we document there very graphically, what happens as people move into the city and go into basically a slum. But on paper, they are now earning, even if you're earning $1 a day, it looks like progress to these blind econometric thinkers. And I'd love to know the name of that person who said that. Do you remember that?
I don't know, but I can try and track it down and send it to you.
Okay. All right. Well, if you have time, I'm thrilled to hear somebody else saying that because it's certainly what we've been trying to say for a long time. But to come back to also to the climate issue, the tragedy also of not only the movement lobbying for poor countries to have the right to increase emissions, but not being informed about the fact that as a consequence of this corporate global spread, we are in a situation where countries are routinely importing and exporting the same thing. And we're talking about importing and exporting water, plastic waste, nuclear waste. We're talking about old, logs, clear cutting ancient growth forests, and importing and exporting this wood. Most horrifically, we're talking about an import and export of food that people need every day. To have a system where the basic essentials for your diet come from further and further away, and not to have people talk about that as they talk about climate change it's crazy, but
Yeah.
mainly people are not aware. They've not been given the information that literally the US exports 1.5 billion tons of beef and turns around and imports 1.5 billion tons of beef annually. The UK exports vast amounts of butter and milk, and almost in identical quantities import milk and butter. Now, this is going on everywhere. At the same time, I can give you examples. Wheat exported from Australia to England, wheat imported from France to Australia. This is utter madness. Why is it happening? Because if around the world we all ate our basic diet. We're not saying ending trade. We can import things that we can't just, we can't produce. But if we had our basic foodstuffs coming from our countries and our regions, no multinational would make money. So this swap literally comes out of a system that has always extracted wealth for the global traders. And it really has from the very beginning. And the basic principle of economic growth, comparative advantage, was to say that it's not in your interest to be self-reliant. This is something we call subsistence. It's horrible, it's hardship. You specialize for export, and then you can import all the things you need. Now, we have to urgently re-examine that. And then we have to also wake up to the fact that not only do we have this insane trade, but on a daily basis, fish is flown from Norway, from America, from Australia to China to be processed and flown back again. You have, nuts flown from Australia to China to be cracked open. You have shrimp flown from the UK to Thailand to be peeled and flown back again. You have apples flown to be washed and waxed from the UK to South Africa and then flown back again. Now, I became aware of this because in Ladakh, I suddenly saw in a very short period with development, in comes butter that has been transported over the Himalayas for about 10 days. And it was selling for half the price of local butter. And I started looking at this and thinking about it, and of course realized that it's only because of these massive hidden subsidies, not just for fossil fuels, but for the infrastructure, for the type of education, for the type of science, the type of engineering. The whole system was infused with this idea of cheap oil, which has never been cheap. We have to count millions upon millions of lives in the world wars connected to this resource war. And we have to, really wake up to the fact that when you have a situation where food is being imported and exported, when it's flown across the world to be processed, how can we possibly go along with the idea that individuals in America are to blame for the fact that CO2 emissions are still growing? So we've got to have a massive rethink. Let's really understand that if we wanted to reduce emissions rapidly, systemically, with absolutely minor destructive impact on the majority of people on this planet, we would, from one day to the next, virtually stop importing and exporting the same foodstuff. We would stop flying the food across the world to be processed. We would massively, we can't even put a number on it because most of this isn't being documented. We are almost alone in trying to raise awareness about this. There are people at the grassroots. In fact, I do want to say very clearly that it's wrong to say we're almost alone. I'm saying we're alone among Western environmental groups. But the biggest social movement in the world is actually a movement that most people haven't heard of. And it's Via Campesina, which stands for the way of the farmer. And it's about 200 million small farmers who, since the early 90s, have been trying to raise awareness about the disastrous effect of the trade treaties and about how this dumping of artificially cheap food grown in vast monocultures is destroying their livelihoods and destroying them. So they've been lobbying for essentially food sovereignty for local food economies. But most people haven't heard of them. And this is where we have to understand that the avenues of knowledge have been colonized. And we need to be much, first of all, in terms of action, our big plea is for what we call big picture activism. It's, we urge people, first of all, connect with a few like-minded people. Find some people who agree with you that they really are concerned about what's happening in the world, and they want to get together to see how they might take action. Now, we are offering a platform that says we actually have a formula that is incredibly healing for you as an individual, for your community, and actually for the planet. Please join us in, first of all, getting together, connect with some like-minded people, and then spend a little bit of time examining the issues we face from this more holistic, grounded perspective. And we hope that people will come away realizing that the most effective thing they can do to reduce emissions, to create more secure livelihoods, to restore biodiversity, to increase productivity while reducing the ecological footprint, to reduce plastic, to reduce the transport, to reduce the refrigeration, to reduce the mass pollution from toxic animal factories. I mean, I can give you a longer list, but what I'm saying is the local food movement is the most amazing win-win-win-win strategy for tackling all of those issues simultaneously. Now, I don't know, most people, maybe you as well, Max, will think, well, we don't have time. We don't have time to transform all the food into local food. But the first thing I want to remind people of is if you can support that movement with your voice, that's what big picture activism is about, is speaking out. Maybe, only by addressing, a few people in your network. Try as part of a group to expand that network. But one of the first things you could do is to help prevent the destruction of local food economies, particularly in the global south, but all around the world, helping small farmers stay where they are and helping them diversify for local markets. That's something that could happen relatively quickly. Now, transforming the big giant monocultures, transforming the bigger system, like I said, the reduction of emissions by simply not importing and exporting the same thing would be so massive. And the whole world could breathe a sigh of relief because they've discovered that actually the reason we're not dealing with climate change is because global corporations are setting the agenda. They're actually around the table at every climate negotiation. And I mean, I do want to also tell you that I knew personally the CEO, the multimillionaire who had started the process of big business influencing the environmental movement. And it's someone named Maurice Strong who actually really had good intentions. His wife, Hanne, a friend of mine, a Danish friend, had become very concerned about environmental destruction. She was very grassroots, she was very spiritual, and she influenced Maurice to say, yeah, there is a problem. We really do need to look at sustainability. And he was a self-made multimillionaire from Canada in the oil industry. But he realized, no, we do need to become more sustainable. And of course, the first sort of call for him was to talk to his peers. He wanted to talk, like so many people do, to the powerful, to the CEOs, to the heads of government. And so he linked up with the Prime Minister of Norway and with a CEO in Switzerland his name was Schmidt-Heine. And they essentially framed the big agenda for the meeting in Rio, which was sort of this enormous coming together of the entire global environmental movement. But the problem was that they were not in the position to understand that giant global corporations were the main problem, that scale was fundamental, that we actually needed to support a multitude of smaller businesses accountable to their regions, accountable to democratic process. they were not consciously, and this is definitely my experience, they weren't consciously trying to manipulate the environmental movement. They came from their, big business background to think about how can we be more sustainable. Well, actually, we don't want giant global corporations to be more sustainable. In other words, we don't want them to continue to survive and become bigger and bigger. But that wasn't a question that they were going to be asking. Small is beautiful from Schumacher. And then, of course, Rachel Carson had very clearly spelled out that we must have a big shift in science. We need to become more holistic. And these demands for more holistic thinking and decentralization were taken seriously by governments. And so there were several departments also at universities that were set up with this goal. But unfortunately, the power of big business continued to grow despite that. And as that continued and as their role became more and more important, this is where, from my point of view, we've been going backwards since the 70s. Starting, I mean, actually really taking off in about 87. So by the 90s, and this big meeting in Rio was actually in 92. So it's the last 30, 35 years. Now, please keep in mind that almost everyone recognizes that virtually all the indicators of human and ecological well-being, of physical health, mental health, democracy, all the things we all care about, have been deteriorating in exactly that period, and in a very worrying way. I believe that if we can somehow find a way of getting the bigger picture out. So I'm really glad that you're doing this podcast. I urge people to do their own mini podcast, to do whatever they can to help get the word out, and to and to look at something like look at our website. I mean, we're linked to lots of other organizations too, but unfortunately, we and most of these organizations are not as visible as they should be. And unfortunately, many of our colleagues have decided, I think, that it's more expedient to say just focus on climate. And but we're basically saying focusing on climate without the big picture has ended us up where we are. We must. So another way that that's happening is that if we decide to have this big green flag, we are likely to be alienating the people who are so frightened that they're not going to be able to have food on the table or pay their mortgage, and who are manipulated by demagogues who take advantage, the shock jocks and so on, who keep driving the fear of the outsider, of the other, and creating, as I hope you've seen that social dilemma film. Have you seen that?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that the social dilemma is telling us how seriously manipulated we're being, and as I see it, the algorithm is really what I blame now. I mean, I'm seeing algorithms in social media, but more importantly, algorithms in the financial world and in the world of the giant global businesses. It's become like this monstrous octopus algorithm machine that knows that polarization and breakdown extracts wealth for the few at the expense of the many. It's a blind machine, like looking at where are the dollars increasing, and the dollars are increasing, out of view. They are impoverishing the nation state. National governments are getting poorer and poorer. Now, after COVID, suddenly there's some money there to deal with a few aspects of the health crisis. But I'm afraid that we have to realize that it's because the algorithm and the global corporations that are swimming within that global system realize that some dollars have to trickle down to keep things going. But we really, we need what I'm calling eco-literacy, which is both economic literacy and ecological literacy. Yeah, and that the other thing I'd like to say is that we need both economic literacy and eco-literacy, but the eco-literacy also really includes what I would call psycho-literacy or social literacy. And that comes down to the fact that we have lots of evidence that people need to feel connected to other people. In other words, they need community. And the demand for community, the desire for community, if we open our eyes to the lenses that we're talking about, it is so obvious. We will see that the most intractable addictions, whether alcohol, drug, even violence, have been cured in relatively short periods by helping people to come together into a circle, into community, to share with others their journey of transformation. So much of the depression, even suicide, that by the way is escalating in virtually every country, is connected to feeling isolated. So coming together is absolutely essential. And this is, again, I could give you lots more evidence, but for instance, Johan Hari's book is one that I would recommend very strongly, Lost Connection. Now, this aspect of what we're talking about is completely linked to why localizing is so fundamental to our well-being and to the well-being of ecosystems. So in terms of localizing, we're talking about either supporting or recreating interdependence with more human scale institutions. We have to remember that in the economy, everything we need comes from nature. And now we're being pushed into these giant cities where we depend on it doled out from these giant unhealthy corporations. As we start localizing, as we start building local business alliances, local finance strategies, local energy systems, and start building the community fabric, and where people have a face and a name and a human being to talk to, even if it's over Zoom, there's a human being there. You're not talking to the robot that you have to talk to when you're trying to talk to a big travel company or to your government or to these giant institutions. So that human scale, that human connection is fundamental for our well-being. And this is also why for us, why we feel optimism is that every day we get more news of more of this happening. And COVID helped to spark this remarkable rebuilding of community. Even when people couldn't meet, they were organizing themselves to support each other in their neighborhoods. And this is happening in cities as well as in rural areas. But what's fundamental is that when you start rebuilding those structures, you start actually coming alive more. And so people are getting more energy. They're feeling more hopeful about the future. When you change the I to a we, so it's not just, well, what am I going to do about this huge series of problems we're facing? But here is an invitation through localization, certainly through local futures, to come together with a few like-minded people and then to look at action. And the news that we get, particularly from the local food movement, is just remarkable. We're seeing how not only do shorter distances from the soil and the earthworm to the plate, shortening those distances, not with an absolute, it's a process of gradually building up more local food systems. But as you start shortening, you are stimulating with market pressure, with the local market, a market closer to the farm, you pressure for diversification. So you're actually creating an economic structure that encourages naturally ecological production by encouraging diversification. And we have to be aware that in the mainstream organic movement, that's been overlooked. And it's a big problem. It's a big problem with this new fashion for regenerative agriculture. We need to be looking at the need for shorter distances or localizing and diversification, how they're linked. Structurally, the farmers who have been pressured into the global economy are pressured from the get-go to do bigger and bigger monoculture with more and more energy and technology replacing people and destroying the soil, destroying the water. Monocultures can't work. So there's this sort of absoluteness to the need for shortening distances. Yeah.
I really appreciate you coming on, Helena. Thanks so much for taking the time.
Well, thank you.
I'm so glad that you have dedicated yours to working on it.
Oh, well, thank you so much. I'm really glad you're interested, and hope we'll stay in touch and collaborate.
Yeah, okay, I'll reach out. Thanks, Helena.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
This is Max Wilbert, one of the hosts of the Green Flame podcast. I want to thank you for listening to our show and let you know a few ways that you can support the Green Flame. First, you can subscribe to our platform using the podcasting system of your choice. We're listed on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Pocket Cast, and all the rest. We're even on YouTube. Leaving us a positive review or rating on these platforms helps us reach a larger audience. You can also share these shows with your friends. If you're interested in donating to support the production of the Green Flame, please visit deepgreenresistance.org. And finally, the goal of this show is to activate people. So if you really want to support this show, start organizing in your own community. Thank you again for listening.